She came to an abandoned pond to search for artifacts, but the magnet caught a small cube that had been lying at the bottom for decades. When it was opened, it became clear that this was not a forgotten object, but evidence of someone else's secret, which they had tried to hide at all costs. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The forest swallowed the road long before Lauren Harper realized how far she had driven from anything that resembled a town. The last cellular signal had vanished miles earlier, replaced by the steady hum of insects and the whisper of tall pines leaning over the narrow dirt path. Lauren drove slowly, careful with every rut and exposed root, her tires crunching over gravel and fallen needles. She had researched this region for months, convinced that the forest hid remnants of a long-forgotten hunting culture that once lived on these lands. What she had not expected was the silence, an unnerving, heavy silence that pressed into the cabin of her Jeep the deeper she went. She finally reached the small clearing marked on her map, a pale stretch of earth, wedged between trees so tall they looked like pillars of an ancient cathedral. She turned off the engine and stepped outside, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that always came with the start of a new field season. The air tasted of resin and damp foliage, and somewhere in the distance, a raven called, the sound echoing like a warning. She began unloading her equipment with the practiced ease of someone who had spent half her life in the field. Tents, folded tarps, plastic crates with brushes and trowels, a metal detector, notebooks, and an assortment of tools more suited for archaeology than the wilderness. But she had also brought her magnetic fishing gear, a heavy neodymium magnet attached to a strong cord. It wasn't a standard archaeological tool, yet Lauren believed that if the stories she'd heard were true, it might be more useful here than a shovel. By late morning, her camp was assembled. She sat on a folding chair for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the environment. The forest around her felt old, but not in the gentle, welcoming way she knew from other sites. This place seemed to hold its breath. The locals had not been particularly helpful when she asked questions. The general store clerk had looked at her map and simply said, "Some places aren't worth your time," before turning away. An older man sitting by the window muttered something about a pruned that kept secrets better than people. Lauren had tried to ask him what he meant, but he only shook his head. The only person who had offered anything resembling information was the forest ranger, a gaunt man with pale eyes and a strange impatience in his voice. He had pointed toward the dense northern section of the woods and said, "There's a pond there. Folks don't go near it. Not because it's haunted. Don't go telling ghost stories now, but because things sink in it. Metal, mostly. Don't know why anyone would throw things in a pond, but people did. If you're looking for artifacts, that might interest you. But I'd stay on the trails if I were you." Lauren had smiled politely, though the ranger's tone had made her uneasy. Now, sitting alone in her clearing, she felt that unease growing. Still, the purpose of her trip outweighed any anxiety. Once the sun rose higher, she packed her tools into a small day bag, slung the magnet and rope over her shoulder, and headed toward the northern trail. The walk to the pond took longer than she expected. The forest floor was a mess of tangled roots, decaying branches, and uneven patches of moss that swallowed her boots. The path was barely visible, more memory than trail, and twice she had to backtrack after realizing she was drifting off course. As the trees thickened, the air grew cooler and damper, carrying the scent of stagnant water. She heard the pond before she saw it, an almost imperceptible lapping, like something shifting lazily beneath the surface. The pond appeared suddenly between the trees, a dark oval of water that reflected nothing. The surface was covered in thin sheets of algae that glistened a sickly green in the muted sunlight. Thick roots stretched into it like skeletal fingers, and a few dead branches floated slowly from one side to the other. There were no birds here, no dragonflies skimming the surface, not even the croak of a frog. The stillness unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Lauren walked the perimeter, studying the shape of the shore and taking notes. There were no obvious signs of human activity, no recent tracks, no litter, no remnants of old campsites. But near the waterline she noticed a thin wooden post leaning at an awkward angle, its surface weathered into illegibility. Whatever message had once been carved into it had long since been erased by time. She tied one end of the cord to her wrist, tested the magnet's weight, and gave it a practiced sweep through the air before letting it drop into the pond with a muted splash. Ripples spread outward, disturbing the veneer of perfect stillness for just a moment. She let the magnet sink, feeding out the cord slowly, feeling the tension in her hands as it sank deeper. At first there was nothing, just the muted resistance of water. She dragged it along the bottom in long arcs, collecting only silt and bits of unidentifiable debris that clung to the magnet like soggy dust. Several casts yielded the same nothing, but Lauren persisted. It wasn't unusual to spend hours searching before finding anything worthwhile. She adjusted her footing, leaned closer to the water, and threw the magnet deeper toward the center. This time, halfway through the sweep, the rope jerked violently. She tightened her grip with both hands, her muscles straining. Whatever the magnet had caught was heavier than anything she had ever pulled from water before. The weight fought against her, as if the object were anchored. She steadied her stance, planting her boots firmly into the muddy bank, and began the slow, laborious process of lifting. Inch by inch, the rope tightened, water bubbling at the surface as something large rose from the depths. Her heart pounded with effort and curiosity. Finally, a dark shape emerged beneath the algae, pushing aside the green film as it broke the surface. Lauren recoiled slightly. What she pulled from the water was no ancient tool, no fragment of a hunting spear or rusted trap. It was a cube, a small metal cube, about 20 centimeters wide, its edges softened by rust and layers of muck. She dragged it fully onto the bank, breathing heavily. The mud clung to it, turning its surfaces into a patchwork of brown and orange. Even in its decrepit state, the cube felt unnervingly deliberate. Its surfaces were too flat, its corners too crisp. It looked manufactured, shaped with precision. She knelt beside it, brushing away slime with the corner of her sleeve. As she explored the surface, she noticed something odd. There were no seams, no hinges, no latch. The entire object seemed to be formed from one unbroken piece of metal. But as she leaned closer, she saw a faint line in one corner, like a welded edge that had been ground down and aged beyond recognition. And beneath a thin patch of rust, she detected the ghostly remains of engraved letters, half erased by time, but unmistakably human. The cube was far heavier than it should have been for its size. She tried lifting it with both hands and nearly fell forward from the unexpected weight. Inside, something shifted with a compact, muted thump. Something small but dense. Lauren sat back on her heels, trying to reconcile what she'd found. This wasn't a natural formation or a random discarded object. Someone had sealed something inside this metal box and thrown it into the pond deliberately. And judging by the depth and layers of rust, it had been there for decades. She reached for her compass out of habit, intending to note the direction of the shoreline. When she flipped it open, she paused. The needle spun aimlessly, unable to settle. She checked her phone. No service, not even a faint bar. Earlier that morning, she'd had a weak but usable signal. Now there was nothing. The temperature seemed to shift around her, a subtle warm breath from the pond, as if the water itself exhaled. She felt a prickling at the back of her neck. The forest felt different, watchful. Lauren forced herself to stand, lifting the cube with effort and placing it into her pack. She told herself it was only the strangeness of the object and the isolation getting to her. But even as she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the sensation that something unseen had shifted the moment she pulled the cube from the water. By the time she returned to camp, the sun had dipped low behind the tree line, leaving the clearing drenched in a bruised purple light. She struggled with the weight of the cube, sweat running down the side of her face despite the cooling air. She set the metal box beside her tent, wiping her hands on her pants, breathing hard. For a long moment she just stood there, listening. The forest remained silent, but not in its earlier, indifferent way. This silence felt tense, stretched thin, like the forest was holding a secret. As night settled, Lauren prepared her lantern and tools. She planned to examine the cube further, to see what the engraved letters might reveal. But exhaustion overtook her more quickly than she expected, and before she knew it, she was lying in her sleeping bag, staring at the dim outline of the mysterious object just outside her tent. She told herself she would study it in the morning. Yet even as sleep tugged at her, Lauren imagined that something, somewhere just beyond the thin tent fabric, was watching her. The forest seemed to breathe around her. A twig snapped in the darkness, then another. She closed her eyes, not knowing that this first night would be the last peaceful moment she would have for a long time. Morning arrived slowly, as though the forest hesitated to release the night. Lauren woke to the faint gray light filtering through her tent, her eyes still heavy and her senses dulled by restless sleep. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she saw the shadow of the cube through the nylon fabric, the small, angular silhouette sitting exactly where she had left it, and the uneasy memories of the previous evening surged back. The pond, the impossible weight, the strange warmth in the air, the compass spinning like a broken toy, and the feeling she couldn't name, the sensation that she had disrupted something that had long preferred to remain undisturbed. She unzipped the tent, bracing herself for the chill, but the air wasn't cold. The clearing was still and oddly warm for such an early hour, as if some invisible boundary insulated the camp. She stepped out, stretching stiff muscles, and approached the cube. Dew had gathered across its rusted surface, creating small beads that clung to the metal before sliding off. In the gentle light of dawn, the corrosion looked even older, more pronounced. Time had worked its way deep into the seams, if they could even be called seams, creating an appearance of age that felt both natural and deliberate. Lauren set up a portable work table, wiping it down before placing the cube at its center. She retrieved her brushes, cloths, and magnifying glass, feeling a familiar, almost comforting sense of routine. Examination. Documentation. Analysis. This was the part of archaeological work she knew by heart, the part that made the world predictable. Yet even as she settled into her process, she sensed that predictability slipping away. As she cleaned the first surface, carefully brushing off layers of compacted dirt and rust, she uncovered the faint outline of initials. They were nearly illegible, reduced to shallow grooves by decades of corrosion, but not entirely lost. The letters appeared to be part of a maker's mark or signature, something a craftsman might etch into a finished piece. But the style was wrong for anything primitive. It wasn't carved by hand, it was stamped or engraved by a machine. That alone sent a ripple of curiosity through her. Who would manufacture a small metal cube, seal it completely, and discard it in a forest pond? She moved on to another face of the cube and noticed a faintly raised rectangle, perhaps the remnant of a label or a plate that had been scraped away or rusted off. Beneath it, a deep scratch ran diagonally, as though someone had attempted to remove an identifying feature. This discovery unsettled her more than the engraved initials. Someone hadn't merely sealed this cube. They had tried to erase its origin. Once the surfaces were clean enough to photograph, Lauren retrieved her camera and began snapping detailed images from every angle. The sun had risen enough to cast steady light across the clearing. Leaves rustled gently overhead, but the birds remained absent. She noticed their silence again and tried to ignore the implication. It was just the season, she told herself, or the hour. But deep down, she knew better. Forests do not fall silent without reason. When she finished the external examination, she sent a few photos to her archaeological group chat, adding a brief message. Pulled this from a pond. Strange construction. Thoughts? It was a habit she had formed over years of fieldwork throwing oddities into the shared channel, knowing someone might recognize a detail she had missed. She attached several angles, including the initials, the scratch, and the welded corner. Then she set the phone down and continued her work, unaware of how that single, casual action would unleash a cascade of events beyond her control. While she focused on the cube, the forest began to shift in subtle ways. A branch snapped in the distance. The wind carried the sound toward her, faint but distinct. She paused, listening. But when no other sound followed, she forced herself to resume. Another snap echoed shortly after closer this time. She straightened once more. Her fingers tightened around the brush. She scanned the tree line, searching for movement. Nothing. The stillness returned, thicker than before. It was several minutes before she heard the buzz of her phone. Notifications chimed one after another. She wiped her hands and checked the messages. Her colleagues had responded quickly, fascinated, puzzled, eager to interpret the object. A few suggested it was a modern lockbox. Others speculated corrosion from industrial waste had distorted its shape. But one message stood out, buried among the others. It simply read, "Where did you find this? It looks familiar. Please send coordinates." The name on the message was an unfamiliar one, an older colleague she had spoken to only once at an academic conference. She hesitated. Why would he need coordinates for something he only vaguely recognized in a photo? Before she could respond, another message arrived from him. "This isn't archaeological. You should hand it to local authorities." Lauren frowned, confused by the sudden urgency. She typed a short reply. "Thanks, but I'll take it to a lab after documenting it," and set the phone aside again. She assumed he was being overly cautious, but that assumption too would prove costly. She spent the next hours examining every centimeter of the cube until sunlight filtered through the trees at a different angle, and the forest floor warmed beneath her boots. The longer she worked, the more she felt the weight of invisible eyes on her back. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly. The trees remained still, but the sensation persisted. When she finally pulled away from the table, ready to take a break, she noticed the tire tracks. They were faint, partially hidden beneath fallen needles, but not old enough to be fully eroded. She crouched beside them. They weren't her tracks. They hadn't been there the previous afternoon. Someone had driven near her camp sometime during the night or early morning. Lauren's pulse quickened. She rose slowly, scanning the perimeter of the clearing. The tracks led to the northern trail, a path she hadn't walked since the previous day. Whoever had been there had left quietly. She looked toward the cluster of trees beyond her tent. The shadows seemed deeper now. She tried to shake off her unease, but as she returned to her table, she found her journal lying slightly open, despite having closed it earlier. Her backpack had shifted positions. None of these things proved anything on their own. Field camps weren't stable environments, and forest creatures had a habit of nudging objects. Yet nothing was disturbed out of hunger or curiosity. There were no claw marks, no signs of nibbling. just the strange impression of someone rifling through her belongings. Her breath tightened. She looked at the cube. Its rusted face reflected a distorted version of her expression. Tense, uncertain. Whatever she had found, someone else wanted it. She considered packing everything and heading back to town immediately. But rational thought intervened. If she left the camp now, it would take hours to navigate the narrow dirt roads back to civilization. And without knowing who or what had entered her camp, she couldn't guarantee her safety on the drive. She needed daylight and clear mind. Instead, she chose to secure the cube. She placed it inside a metal lockbox, wrapped it in additional protective cloths, and stored it under the heaviest crate she had, weighing it down further with rocks. If someone returned, they wouldn't be able to take it quietly. As evening approached, Lauren prepared a small fire, though the heat did little to ease the sickness growing in her stomach. The forest remained unnervingly still. Leaves rustled without wind. Birds never returned to their perches. She found herself glancing at the tree line repeatedly, each time half expecting to see a figure peering out. When night fell, she double-checked the perimeter of her camp, locking her jeep and securing the zippers of her tent. The cube lay hidden beneath layers of gear, heavy enough to make dragging it away difficult, even for someone determined. She soothed herself with this thought, before finally lying down inside her tent. Sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the forest felt amplified. The hush of the wind sounded like footsteps. Now and then something brushed against the tent, soft and deliberate. She held her breath, listening. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She couldn't tell if she was hearing wildlife or a person. She lay in rigid silence until exhaustion finally dragged her under. It was perhaps 2 hours into the night when a noise pulled her violently awake. A metallic scrape, faint but undeniable. She bolted upright, her breath trapped in her chest. The sound came again. Slow. Measured. Someone was moving near the work table where she had examined the cube. She reached for her flashlight slowly, careful not to rustle the sleeping bag. The scrape paused. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then footsteps drifted toward the side of the tent, just beyond the thin barrier of fabric. She could hear the soft pressure of weight settling onto damp ground. Someone was standing right outside. She held her breath, terrified that any movement would give her away. The figure lingered, silent except for a slow inhalation that felt too controlled to belong to an animal. After what felt like an eternity, another sound joined the breathing. A faint rustle of paper being slipped beneath the tent flap. Then the footsteps retreated. Branches cracked softly. The presence faded into the forest. Lauren waited several minutes before daring to turn on the flashlight. The beam illuminated a small piece of paper, creased and damp. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. 4 words were scrawled in a hurried, uneven hand. "You should leave now." Her fear deepened into something colder, more sinking. This was no misunderstanding. Someone knew she had the cube. Someone wanted her gone. And someone was close enough to warn her or threaten her. She sat awake the rest of the night, her flashlight gripped tightly in her hand, her eyes fixed on the shadowy outline of the cube hidden beneath her supplies. She understood now that the strange weight she felt in the air since the moment she pulled the cube from the pond was not her imagination. Something had begun, and whatever waited in the darkness was not finished with her. Lauren left the campsite before dawn, the world around her washed in a pale bluish light that barely distinguished tree from shadow. She had hardly slept, her nerves frayed by the incessant fear that someone might return in the middle of the night. The warning note lay folded inside her jacket pocket, the crease worn down from how often she had run her fingers along it. She packed in silence, her mind replaying the noise outside her tent, each soft footstep, each crack of branches exaggerating itself inside her memory until every detail felt like a threat. The forest seemed to observe her as she worked, offering no comfort or distraction. The air was cool, but sweat trickled down her back from the tension that had filled her since midnight. She lifted the heavy lockbox containing the cube, grunting at the weight. She had wrapped it in layers of canvas and placed padding around it. But even still, the sheer density of the object made it unwieldy. It was almost unnatural for something so small to weigh so much. She carried it carefully toward the jeep, looking over her shoulder more times than she cared to count. At last, she secured the lockbox behind the passenger seat and closed the door with the softest push she could manage, as though afraid the sound would summon whoever had visited her camp. The dirt path leading out of the clearing looked different in the early light, softened by dew, but also somehow more ominous. Lauren climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and paused, the faint vibration of the jeep sending a ripple of unease up her arms. Leaving wasn't a choice anymore. It was a necessity. She had awakened something. Or rather, she had disturbed someone who believed the cube should never have resurfaced. The ranger's vague warnings now felt deliberate rather than dismissive, though she still couldn't determine what role he played in all of this. She shifted into gear and began the slow journey out of the woods. The trees pressed closely around the narrow road, rising like pillars on either side. Sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy overhead, casting faint streaks across the windshield. The weight of the lockbox behind her felt like a presence, heavy and silent. She couldn't shake the sense that she was transporting something far more important and far more dangerous than she understood. At the same time, her instincts as an archaeologist told her she was on the edge of uncovering a pivotal discovery, though not one she had expected. This wasn't a relic of a lost culture. This was evidence of something buried deliberately, something from a not-so-distant past. She had driven no more than 15 minutes when she saw the vehicle, a dark pickup truck idling in the middle of the dirt path, blocking her way. She slowed, her pulse quickening. The truck's windows were tinted, and no one stepped out. She tried honking lightly, hoping the driver was a hunter, or a local who would move aside once aware of her presence. Nothing. Not even a flicker of movement from inside. Lauren's mind raced back to the tire tracks she had seen at her campsite, the anonymous messages, the footsteps at night. It felt too coincidental. She put the jeep in reverse and backed slowly down the path, her eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the unmoving truck. She could not go back to the clearing. She didn't dare. Instead, as soon as she gained enough distance, she steered sharply into a narrow break between trees, an unmarked trail barely visible beneath a patchwork of roots and moss. Her jeep lurched as it entered the rough ground, branches scraping the vehicle's sides. She pushed forward, navigating through the forest as quickly as she dared. After several tense minutes, she reconnected with the main trail farther to the south, relieved to find it empty. She continued driving, her breath shaky, checking her mirrors repeatedly. She felt half convinced that the pickup would reappear behind her at any moment, its dark silhouette emerging between the trees like an omen. When she finally reached the paved road that connected the forest to the nearest town, the sense of dread eased slightly. Civilization meant safety, at least for now. Houses came into view, small farms with peeling fences and barns that looked older than the town itself. She passed a gas station where two men sat on crates outside, staring as she drove past. It wasn't an unfriendly stare, just the silent curiosity of isolated communities. But after the night she had endured, every pair of eyes felt intrusive, suspicious. Lauren made her way straight to the university. She chose not to stop anywhere on the way, not even for fuel, and by the time she arrived, her tank was nearly empty. The campus was quiet, most students still in their morning classes. She parked in the small lot behind the science building, close to the lab where she had arranged for equipment to be available. Her hands shook slightly, as she pulled the lockbox from the back seat, its weight anchoring her resolve. If she could open the cube and see its contents, she would finally understand what had driven someone to hide it in a pond, and what had driven someone else to warn her away from it. Inside the lab, fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a pale glow over the rows of instruments and tables. The space smelled faintly of metal, solder, and disinfectant, the amalgam of modern science she had always found comforting. 2 technicians were preparing equipment, setting up a cutting station and checking safety gear. They exchanged puzzled glances as Lauren entered with the lockbox, but neither asked questions. They knew she rarely brought something trivial into the lab. She placed the lockbox on the main table and opened it carefully. The cube inside gleamed dully under the overhead lights, its rusted surface almost shimmering in the stark brightness. One of the technicians leaned closer to inspect it, but recoiled slightly when he lifted it an inch off the table. "How is this thing so heavy?" he muttered, rubbing his wrist. Lauren didn't have an answer. Even she was unsure whether the weight was simply a physical anomaly or a symbolic burden tied to whatever the cube concealed. The process of opening the cube began with a series of scans. They used a handheld spectrometer to test the composition of the metal. The readings surprised them. It was an alloy uncommon even in industrial applications, dense and extremely difficult to penetrate. Next came the X-ray machine, which revealed indistinct shapes inside too blurred to identify clearly, but undeniably manufactured objects rather than natural debris. Something metallic. Something intentionally placed. Lauren felt the weight of anticipation knotting in her stomach. She knew this moment would shape everything that happened next. Finally, the technicians prepared the industrial cutter, a machine capable of slicing through nearly any metal with enough precision not to damage its contents. They secured the cube in place, donned protective gear, and activated the cutter. The blade whirred, sparks flying as it made contact with the cube, sending fragments of rust and metal scattering. The sound filled the lab, loud and insistent, but Lauren barely heard it. She was watching the metal separate inch by inch, a thin line of molten red marking the cube's first wound in decades. The welded seam, once nearly invisible, began to open. It took nearly an hour to cut through all 4 sides. When the top finally loosened and lifted away, the lab fell silent. Inside were several objects arranged with care, each wrapped in layers of deteriorated cloth. Lauren reached for gloves and carefully began unwrapping the items. The first object to emerge was a small revolver, heavily rusted but unmistakably intact. She froze, her breath catching. The second was a cluster of spent shell casings tied together with ancient string. The third object was a silver pendant, tarnished, but clearly engraved with initials. The fourth was a small folded map, edges burned, the paper brittle under her touch. The last object was a thin roll of microfilm, preserved remarkably well despite its age. The air around her felt denser, heavier. She sensed, even before she processed the significance, that these items were not random. They were connective threads of a story that someone had needed to bury. Someone who believed they could erase the past with metal and water. She lifted the pendant first, brushing a layer of dust from its surface. The initials engraved on it shimmered faintly. A name, perhaps a memory, perhaps a lost life. She opened the map next. The burned edges made it difficult to decipher, but she recognized the outline almost instantly. It was the region where she had camped. The pond was marked, circled in black ink, but another smaller mark lay deeper in the forest, near an area she had not explored, a location that was important enough to annotate, yet sinister enough to hide. The microfilm drew her attention next. It was far too small to decipher without equipment, so she passed it to one of the technicians, who quickly loaded it into a viewer. What they saw was even more disturbing. Documents, ledgers of payments, logs of conversations, and signatures belonging to individuals who appeared to hold positions of authority. There were references to a man who had disappeared decades earlier, a master craftsman who had worked for a local workshop and vanished unexpectedly. The workshop name matched the faint initials she had seen earlier on the cube. The microfilm contained what looked like a record of transactions, bribes, and cover-ups, all tied to something that had gone horribly wrong. Lauren felt a chill spread through her chest, her earlier fear evolving into something more profound and far more dangerous. The cube had not been merely discarded. It had been sealed with care, dropped into a pond far from town, and hidden beneath layers of decay to erase its truths. And now she had them spread across a laboratory table, exposed in the stark glow of fluorescent lights. She could almost sense how much these artifacts threatened those who had once wielded power in this small region. It was then, as she stood staring at the objects, that a shadow crossed the window of the lab door. A figure passed by slowly, pausing for a moment before moving on. Lauren stiffened, her breath hitching. She wasn't alone. Someone had followed her. Someone who had likely been tracking her since she left the forest. The technician nearest the door frowned and stepped toward it. But when he opened it, the corridor was empty. Still, the air felt changed, charged with danger. They resumed analyzing the items, though Lauren's focus drifted repeatedly toward the hallway. The cutting machine had quieted, leaving an eerie stillness in its absence. The lab felt too quiet, too vulnerable. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she examined the small revolver again, imagining the hands that had once held it. Hands that had committed or concealed violence. By late afternoon, the atmosphere in the lab had shifted again, tension thickening like a storm about to break. Lauren was packing away the microfilm and wrapping the pendant carefully when she sensed movement at the doorway. She turned just as the door swung open and two men stepped inside. Their posture, their expressions, and the intensity in their eyes left no room for misinterpretation. They were not students. They were not staff. They were here for her. One of them spoke softly, almost politely. "You need to give us the box, and everything inside it." Lauren's throat tightened. She felt the technicians beside her stiffen. For a moment, no one moved. Then everything happened at once. A technician reached for the panic button near the counter. One of the men lunged. A chair clattered to the floor. Lauren instinctively grabbed the map and the microfilm, clutching them to her chest as she ducked behind the table. The alarm triggered, blaring through the lab. Lights flashed red. The intruders cursed and made for the exit, slipping out the door before security could arrive. When the hallways flooded with guards, Lauren stood frozen, struggling to breathe, her mind struggling to accept the reality of what was unfolding. She understood, in that moment, exactly what the cube represented. Not a relic, not a curiosity, a secret that powerful people had once killed to bury. And now, she had unearthed it. By the time the alarms ceased their shrill echo through the laboratory hallways, Lauren felt as if something inside her had fundamentally shifted. Fear had long ago outrun shock. What settled in its place now was a cold, hardened clarity. She stood in the center of the lab, surrounded by overturned equipment and scattered tools, still holding the map and microfilm tight against her chest. Security personnel moved through the building in deliberate, synchronized motions, checking doors and questioning anyone who happened to be nearby when the intruders fled. But Lauren knew instinctively that the men who had appeared in the doorway were not amateurs who could be caught in a routine sweep. They had come prepared. They had left prepared. They were part of something that was larger than her, larger even than the cube she had recovered from the pond. And that realization burrowed deep into her thoughts. A campus police officer approached her with a clipboard in hand, his expression careful, respectful, but distant. He asked her to recount everything she remembered. She tried to speak clearly, but her voice trembled despite her best efforts. She described the men, their height, their clothing, the way they moved, as though describing the shadows cast by a fire she had only glimpsed for a moment. The officer nodded, writing everything down diligently, yet Lauren could already see the doubt forming in the tension of his jaw. 2 men attacking a university lab in broad daylight for an old metal cube sounded far-fetched, implausible, the kind of exaggeration someone might invent after a fright. But the lab's panic system had recorded the intrusion, and that, at least, gave her claim legitimacy. When the questioning ended, Lauren found herself once again beside the table, where the cube's contents lay spread out under harsh fluorescent light. The revolver, the gill casings, the pendant, the burned map. Each item now appeared to her not as an artifact, but as a fragment of a dreadfully human story. These pieces had belonged to someone who had trusted too deeply or resisted too openly. Someone who had been silenced. Someone whose truth had been buried inside a cube, crafted with such precision and sealed with such permanence that it was meant to stay submerged for the rest of time. She ran a finger over the pendant, noting the delicacy of its engraving despite the years of tarnish. For a single painful moment, she imagined the person who once wore it, someone who had carried it close to their skin, someone who had loved or been loved enough for their initials to be commemorated in silver. It struck her then how cruelly the cube had been conceived. It was not a time capsule or a memorial, it was a coffin of evidence. The microfilm worried her most. Its contents were too explicit to dismiss. Names, dates, transactions, signatures, all chronicled in minute detail. Evidence of a criminal network operating through the county nearly 40 years ago. Evidence that connected the death of a craftsman, the same man whose workshop name was faintly etched into the cube, to at least 3 public officials whose careers had flourished in the years after his disappearance. Evidence that officials still alive might kill to recover. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat in a small office adjacent to the lab, the map unfolded in her lap, her eyes tracing the burned edges. The markings on the map pulled her attention over and over to the same point deep in the forest, a location far from any roads or trails. It was circled in ink with a small cross beside it, perhaps where the body had been found, or perhaps where it was supposed to be buried. She imagined the craftsman walking those woods the night he disappeared. She imagined the fear he must have felt, the knowledge that his killers had taken him to a place where his cries would be swallowed by the dark and the trees. And Lauren felt, in the weight of that silence, a responsibility she had never known before. She had brought this story to the surface. Now she had to finish the work. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. A man in an unmarked suit stepped in, flashing a badge that identified him as a federal agent. He introduced himself as Agent Holloway and asked to see the cube and its contents. Lauren felt exhaustion pull at her muscles, but she forced herself upright and guided him into the lab. He studied each item silently, his eyes lingering on the revolver and the microfilm. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, the voice of a man who had seen more than he liked to remember. "This isn't just evidence," he said. "It's testimony. Someone tried to tell the truth, and someone else buried it. 38 years ago, a missing persons investigation was closed without proper documentation. Records went missing. Statements were lost. This," he gestured to the table, "fills in the gaps. It might even be enough to open a federal inquiry." A swell of relief and dread filled Lauren simultaneously. Relief because someone finally believed her, Dread, because federal inquiry was a phrase that could endanger more than reputations. It could uproot lives, expose networks, and place everyone involved, including her, at significant risk. Holloway promised protection, but even he admitted that protection was not perfect. "If the people behind this are who I suspect they are," he said, "they won't stop because you're on record. They'll only become more desperate." He handed her a contact card, instructing her to call him directly if anything unusual occurred. She wanted to laugh at that. Everything had been unusual from the moment she pulled the cube from the pond, but she nodded, tucking the card into her pocket. The next morning, Lauren made the decision to send the documents to multiple independent sources. She contacted investigative journalists she trusted, sending copies of the microfilm scans, photos of the cube's contents, and a detailed account of how she had found it. She sent the same to a private forensic historian she had worked with in the past, a man known for exposing government corruption through methodical archival work. Lastly, she sent digital files to Agent Holloway, ensuring that no matter what happened to her, the information would continue to spread. That afternoon, Holloway returned with a small team. They escorted her to a secure briefing room and laid out the plan to investigate the forest pond. A forensic dive team would be deployed to search for additional containers or remains. The burned map suggested there had been more than one burial. The idea that more metal cubes might lie beneath the murky water made Lauren's skin crawl. How many truths had been sealed under the surface? She accompanied the team to the site 2 days later. Standing once more on the pond's edge, she felt a visceral sense of memory pressing down on her. The cold breath of the water, the unnatural stillness, the weight of the cube as she dragged it onto the bank. The trees were silent, their branches bowing slightly, as if in mourning or in reluctant acknowledgement of the disturbance. When the divers entered the pond, the water barely rippled, as though the surface resisted being broken again. Hours passed before the team resurfaced with findings, but when they did, the evidence was unmistakable. They had found another object buried deep beneath the silt, a metal fragment that had deteriorated too much to retrieve intact. Its composition, however, matched the alloy used for the cube. It once had been a container of similar design. Nearby, embedded within the muck, were small metal remnants and a corroded hinge. Perhaps the second container had ruptured long ago. Perhaps someone had tried to destroy it. Either way, it confirmed the pond's purpose. It was a dumping ground, a graveyard of secrets. Later that afternoon, further dredging uncovered what the divers initially mistook for a tree root. When they lifted it to the surface, Lauren felt her stomach turn. It was bone-human bone, long submerged, softened by decades of water, but unmistakably evidence of a life extinguished. Investigators immediately cordoned off the area, marking the site as part of an active crime scene. Lauren watched in silence as professionals cataloged each fragment, their meticulous methods mirroring her own archaeological training, yet carrying a different weight. This was not excavation for knowledge. This was excavation for justice. The dredging continued until the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the pond's slick surface with streaks of violet and gold. When the work finally paused, Holloway approached her once more. "This confirms everything the microfilm suggested. There was a network, there was a murder, and there was a cover-up." Lauren breathed deeply, each inhale laced with the faint scent of rotting vegetation and damp earth. She felt tired, hollowed out by the enormity of everything she had unearthed. Yet beneath the exhaustion was a thin, bright filament of purpose that refused to dim. She had not chosen this path, but it had chosen her the moment the magnet had snagged on something beneath the pond's surface. The federal investigation intensified over the following weeks. Several retired officials were subpoenaed. Records sealed decades earlier were reopened under court order. A quiet but insistent storm brewed across the state, fueled by the reports journalists had begun releasing, all sourced from the documents Lauren had shared. The story captured public interest immediately. An archaeologist discovering a cube containing evidence of a decades-old murder. A small-town conspiracy uncovered by accident. The irony of time's attempt to erase truth undone by a moment of curiosity. When Lauren's name began appearing in newspaper headlines, she tried to ignore the swelling attention. She focused instead on the small details of her work, cataloging the cube's items, assisting forensic teams with contextual analysis, guiding investigators through the geography of the burned map. She visited the pond again after the initial frenzy subsided, escorted by Holloway and 2 other agents. The area was quiet, cleared of equipment, the ground scarred by digging but still retaining a strange sense of solemnity. Lauren stood at the edge of the water, listening to the faint rustle of leaves overhead. The pond's surface reflected the sky now, no longer hidden beneath algae and murk. The air felt lighter, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. For the first time since she had arrived in the forest weeks earlier, she felt a sense of closure growing within her. The truth had been buried, but it had not drowned. It had waited patiently in the darkness, preserved in metal and silt and memory until the moment it could rise again. She exhaled slowly and closed her eyes. The forest around her whispered, not in warning this time, but in quiet acknowledgement. She knew she would never forget this place, not the fear she had felt, nor the courage she had been forced to summon, not the men who had once hidden their crimes, nor the man whose fate had been sealed inside a cube meant to erase him from history. Lauren opened her eyes once more, watching the last ripple smooth across the pond's surface. She realized then that she had not merely uncovered a story from the past. She had given voice to someone who had been silenced. She had brought truth to the surface, and sometimes, she thought, that was the only justice time could offer. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Watch the next videos and explore the others we've already posted. Share this video with someone who would want to see it.